So in this lesson, we are going to explain, model, and perform multiplication with integers. So we're going to be multiplying with numbers such as 1, 2, 3, and like -1, -2, and -3, and so on and so forth. Now we're going to use this way of thinking about multiplication. Before we get into it, I want to start off with something that you already are somewhat comfortable with. So 4 times 3. We know that this is 12. Positive 12, really. So let's start from there. So we'll look at the sign. You see how this 4 was a positive. So in reality, we always had, this means we have 4 copies of 3. So I'm going to say that again. We have 4 copies of 3. We have 4 copies of 3. We have 4 copies of 3. This is the next one. 5 times 6 is 30. Actually, in this one, we're not even concentrating on the answers. I just want you to get comfortable with the language. So 5 times 6 really means you have 5 copies. So we have 5 copies of 6. We have 5 copies of 6. So in this one, same thing. This is a positive 3. So we have 3 copies of positive 2. We have 3 copies of 2. If you prefer to put the positive sign, you can there, but it's not required. In this one, once again, the 4 is positive. We have 4 copies of -5. We have 4 copies of -5. Don't forget that if there's nothing in between these two, it means multiply. So we have 2 copies of -7. So we have 2 copies of -7. So in reality, we have positive 2 copies of -7. And this one, this is the first time we say, like, all the numbers that we've done before, where we start off with positive 5, positive 3, positive 4, positive 2. This is the first time we have a negative in front first. We have a negative in front. So -3. So instead of saying we have 3 copies, we actually have the opposite. That's the opposite. We have the opposite of 3 copies of 5. See this -5? Opposite. So we have the opposite of 5 copies of 2. And on this next one, once again, we have that negative in front. So, I should point that to the negative sign. We have the opposite of 3 copies of -4. Do it again. So we have the opposite of 4 copies of -3. This should help us. This should help us with the remaining part of the notes and practice, or the remaining part of the notes and the practice. So right here we have 4 copies of 3. We have 4 copies of 3. So 4 copies of 3. So we have 3, 3, 3, 3. We have 4 copies of 3, which makes 12. because 4 copies of 3 is 4 copies of plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3, which would be positive 3, positive 3, positive, positive 3, positive 12. So in this one, this 3 is a positive once again. So we have 3 copies of positive 2. We have 3 copies of positive 2. Once again, if you like to put the positive there, that's fine. 3 copies of positive 2. So 3 copies. So positive 2, positive 2, positive 2. So plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 is positive 6. If you want to put the positive sign there, you can. Doesn't matter. In example 12, we have 2 copies of negative 5. 2 copies. We have 2 copies. Remember, copies, multiply. We have 2 copies of negative 5. 2 copies of negative 5. Negative 5, negative 5. 2 copies of negative 5 is negative 10, because they're just a bunch of negatives, right? So we have 4 copies. We have 4 copies of negative 7. So 4 copies of negative 7. So negative 7, negative 7, negative 7, negative 7. Or minus 7, minus 7, minus 7, minus 7. Which would be minus or negative 28. I'm going to write that a little smaller. Negative 28. Now remember, this negative sign in the first one means opposite. So we have the opposite of 3 copies. We have the opposite of 3 copies of 6. So 3 copies of 6 would look like this, right? Oh, there's 3 6s. We have 3 copies of 6. But we don't want that. We want the opposite. So we don't want that. We want the opposite, which would be negative 6, negative 6, negative 6. Which would be negative 18. Remember, we don't have 3 copies of 6. We have the opposite of 3 copies of 6. In this one, we have the opposite. We have the opposite of 4 copies of negative 5. So 4 copies of negative 5 would be negative 5, negative 5, negative 5, negative 5. 4 copies of negative 5, but we don't have this. We have the opposite, which is 4 copies of positive 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Positive 20. Once again, we have negative 5, so that means we have the opposite of 5 copies of negative 3. So 5 copies of negative 3. Negative 3, negative 3, negative 3, negative 3, negative 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. But we don't have that. We have the opposite, which is plus 3, plus 3, plus 3, plus 3, plus 3. The opposite. So this makes 3 times 5 is 15. Positive 15. Thank you.